Mateo Lopez would rather starve than let anyone see his lunch, because inside his backpack, wrapped in foil like a secret, were his Abuela's tamales, and at Ridgeview High, being Mexican came with a target on your back. The bell rang, signaling the start of another monotonous day at Ridgeview High, and Mateo Lopez moved through the crowded hallways like a shadow, present but unseen. At 16, he had perfected the art of blending in, a skill born out of necessity rather than choice. His dark hair was styled in a way that mimicked the popular guys at school, his clothes carefully selected to avoid any hint of his Mexican heritage, no bright colors, no patterns that might draw attention. Even his name had been whittled down to something more palatable for his peers, where his teachers and family called him Mateo. His classmates knew him as Matt, a name that felt foreign on his tongue but safe in their ears. Lunchtime was the worst. While others unwrapped sandwiches or bought pizza from the cafeteria, Mateo would slip into the library or hide in a bathroom stall, unwilling to let anyone see the tamales or empanadas his abuela had lovingly packed for him. The scent alone, rich, spiced, unmistakably Mexican, would give him away, and he couldn't risk that. Not again. Not after last year, when Jason Carter and his friends had snatched his lunch bag, torn open a tamale, and sneered, "What even is this? Looks like dog food." The laughter that followed had seared into his memory, a constant reminder that difference was dangerous. So he starved instead, telling himself it was easier that way. But Elena Ruiz, his childhood friend, the one person who refused to let him disappear, wasn't having it. She cornered him by his locker after third period, her dark eyes sharp with disapproval. Unlike Mateo, Elena wore her culture like armor. Her backpack was covered in pins of the Mexican flag. Her wrists jingled with beaded bracelets from family trips to Guadalajara, and she spoke Spanish loudly, unapologetically, even when teachers told her to stick to English. Today, she held out a conchas, the sweet bread still warm from the bakery, and raised an eyebrow when Mateo flinched. "You gonna keep pretending you don't love these?" she asked, her voice laced with challenge. Mateo's stomach growled, but he shook his head, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "Come on, Elena. Not here." She rolled her eyes, shoving the conchas into his hands. "Since when do you hate who you are?" The question hit him like a punch. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the words died in his throat, because the truth was, he didn't hate being Mexican. He just hated how it made him feel, exposed, vulnerable, like a target. Before he could respond, the overhead speakers crackled to life, announcing an upcoming assembly for Cultural Heritage Week. Elena's face lit up. "Perfect. You can finally stop hiding." Mateo's blood ran cold. The flyers plastered on the walls seemed to taunt him. "Celebrate your roots. Share your traditions." His grip tightened on the conchas, crushing it slightly. There was no way he was participating. No way he was giving Jason and his friends another reason to laugh at him. But as he turned to walk away, Elena's voice followed him, sharp and unyielding. "You can't run from yourself forever, Mateo." The warning lingered in the air, heavy with truth. And for the first time in a long time, Mateo wondered if she was right. The call came during sixth period, slicing through the monotonous drone of Mr. Thompson's history lecture like a knife. Mateo's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. 3 consecutive calls from his mother, something she never did unless it was an emergency. Hard hammering. He ducked out of class, barely muttering an excuse to the teacher before pressing the phone to his ear. His mother's voice was frayed at the edges, words tumbling out in a mix of Spanish and frantic English. "Yes to Abuela, esi desmayo en el mercado. La ambulancia la leva al hospital. Ven ahora." The world tilted. Abuela, the woman who had carried him on her hips as a toddler, who sang him lullabies in a voice like warm honey, who still packed his lunches every morning despite his protests. She was never sick. She was the solid earth beneath his feet, the scent of cinnamon and cumin that clung to their home. Now, suddenly, she was fragile. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and dread. Mateo sat stiffly between his parents, hands clenched into fists, replaying every time he'd rejected her food, every time he'd rolled his eyes when she called him "mi Joe" in public. The doctor finally emerged, her expression unreadable, and said the words mild heart attack like they were a death sentence. But Abuela would recover, with rest, with care. Relief flooded him, followed immediately by a crushing wave of guilt. When she was well enough to come home, weak but still sharp-eyed, she demanded Mateo's help in the kitchen. "Vas a prender a hacer el mole," she declared, as if this were non-negotiable. And it was. The recipe was a ritual, passed down through generations. Chilies toasted until their skins blistered, chocolate melted into a symphony of spices, the mortar and pestle grinding history into every bite. As they cooked, Abuela talked. She told him about his grandfather, who had worked triple shifts in a factory to buy their first home, about his great-grandmother selling tamales on the streets of Mexico City during the Revolution. "Esta comida y es nuestra sangre," she said, pressing a spoonful of mole into his palm. The richness of it exploded on his tongue, bitter, sweet, smoky, alive. It tasted like belonging. But later, alone in his room, the fear crept back in. What if none of it mattered? What if he was still just Matt, the kid who dodged his own reflection in the windows of the Mexican bakery downtown? He caught himself whispering Spanish phrases to the mirror, testing the shape of words he'd buried deep, when Elena's voice cut through from the doorway. "Damn, Lopez, you sound almost like a real Mexican." He whirled around, face burning. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, but her smirk faded when she saw his expression. "Why do you do this to yourself?" she asked, softer now. "You're not fooling anyone, especially not you." He wanted to snap back, to tell her she didn't understand the cost of standing out, but the lie stuck in his throat. The next morning, Abuela found him slumped at the kitchen table, picking at a conchas without eating it. She didn't scold. Instead, she cupped his face in her hands, her palms rough from decades of work, and studied him like she could see every crack in his armor. "Mi Joe," she murmured. "No puedes amar la vida as hay días tus races." The words settled into his bones. You can't love life if you hate your roots. Outside, the school bus rumbled to a stop at the curb. Mateo stood slowly, shoulders squaring. For the first time in years, he grabbed the lunch bag Abuela had packed, tamales wrapped in bright red foil, impossible to miss, and walked toward the door without flinching. The posters for Cultural Heritage Week went up overnight, plastered across every bulletin board in Ridgeview High. Bold letters screaming, "Celebrate your roots," alongside clip art globes and smiling, multicultural faces. Mateo avoided them like landmines. But in homeroom, Tyler Miller, the de facto leader of the popular crowd, slapped a sign-up sheet onto his desk with a grin that made Mateo's stomach twist. "We're doing an all-American showcase," Tyler announced, as if this were some grand revelation. "Hot dogs, baseball, apple pie, the works. You and Matt." The way he said it, Matt, not Mateo, felt like a test. Around him, heads nodded eagerly. Someone even hooped. Mateo forced a laugh, the sound hollow in his own ears. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, scribbling his name on the sheet, because what else could he do? But the guilt hit him instantly, a hot wave creeping up his neck. He pictured Abuela's hand shaping tamales, the way her eyes had glittered when she told him about his grandfather's pride in their culture. Now he was reducing his heritage to a checkbox on a form labeled generic. The bell rang, saving him from his thoughts, but as he shoved through the hallway, Jason Carter's voice sliced through the noise. "Check it out. Mariachi Matt finally grew a pair and joined the Murica team." Jason lounged against a locker, flanked by his usual crew, a sneer playing on his lips. "Guess even you knew nobody wants to see your little taco dance." The words were like gasoline on the embers of Mateo's anger. His fists clenched, nails biting into his palms. He wanted to whirl around, to shove Jason against the lockers and snarl, "It's called jarabe tapatio. You ignorant." But he didn't. He kept walking, spine rigid, while laughter trailed him like a shadow. That night, in the dim glow of the garage light, Mateo moved stiffly at first, his body resisting the rhythm of the music streaming through his earbuds. The jarabe tapatio was something he'd only ever seen at family parties, Abuela twirling in her embroidered dress, his uncle stomping in polished boots, all laughter and sweat and pride. Now, Alone with YouTube tutorials and a dusty sombrero he'd dug out of a closet, he felt ridiculous. His steps were clumsy, his spins off balance. But he kept trying, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw Abuela's face in the hospital bed, pale but fierce. You can't love life if you hate your roots. The music swelled. His heels clicked against the concrete, over and over, until his calves burned and his breath came in gasps. Until the dance started to feel less like a performance and more like a rebellion. He didn't notice Elena until she let out a low whistle from the doorway. "Damn, Lopez," she said, eyebrows arched. "You've been holding out on me." Mateo yanked out his earbuds, face flushing. I'm not." Elena held up her phone, the screen displaying the school's talent show sign-up. His name glared back at him in bold letters. Mateo Lopez, traditional Mexican dance. The world lurched. "You didn't," he breathed. She grinned, unrepentant. "Oh, I definitely did." Panic clawed up his throat. "Elena, I can't, Jason. The whole school will finally see you." She interrupted. "Not Matt. Not some watered-down version. You." For a heartbeat, he wanted to scream at her, to tear the paper down, to crawl back into invisibility. But then he remembered the way Jason had laughed at the word taco, the way Tyler had said all-American, like it was the only thing that mattered. The garage wall seemed to press in, tight with the scent of motor oil and Abuela's mole still lingering on his clothes. Elena's gaze didn't waver. "So," she challenged, "you gonna hide forever?" Outside, a car horn blared, distant and sharp. Somewhere a dog barked, and Mateo realized, with a jolt, that his heart wasn't racing with fear anymore. It was pounding with something else entirely, something like defiance. The flyer stared back at Mateo from a school bulletin board like a taunt, his name in bold print for the entire student body to see, listed right between the jazz band and some freshman's magic act. The air left his lungs in a rush, his fingers curling into fists as he whirled on Elena, who stood a few feet away with an unreadable expression. "You had no right," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and panic. The hallway was too loud, too bright, too full of people who would now be watching him, judging him, laughing at him. Elena crossed her arms, unfazed. "Someone had to push you," she shot back, her dark eyes flashing. "You were never going to do it yourself." The accusation stung because it was true, but that didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. "This isn't your life to mess with," he snapped, shoving past her, ignoring her call of Mateo, "Wait," as he stormed out of the school, his chest burning with humiliation. He didn't stop walking until he reached the park near his house, collapsing onto a bench as the weight of what was coming crashed over him. How could she do this? After everything, after knowing how hard he'd worked to stay under the radar, to avoid being that Mexican kid? Now he was trapped. That evening, the house was quiet, the scent of simmering beans and warm tortillas drifting from the kitchen. Abuela sat at the table, her hands busy shredding chicken for dinner, but her gaze lifted when Mateo slumped into the chair across from her. "You look like you lost a fight," she observed, her voice gentle but probing. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "Elena signed me up for the talent show, for Cultural Heritage Week." The words tasted bitter. Abuela didn't react right away, just nodded slowly before pushing back from the table. "Then," she said, motioning for him to follow. She led him to the old wooden chest in the corner of the living room, the one that smelled of mothballs and memories, and pulled out a faded photo album. Inside were black and white images of a young man in a crisp suit, standing tall despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "Your abuelo," she said softly, tracing the edges of the photograph. "He came to this country with nothing, worked 3 jobs, slept on floors. They called him names, told him to go back home." Mateo swallowed hard, staring at the face of the man he'd never met, but whose blood ran in his veins. "But every Sunday," Abuela continued, her voice gaining strength, "he put on his best clothes, played his guitar, and sang rancheras so loud the neighbors complained, because he refused to let them take his joy." She closed the album and pressed it into Mateo's hands. "You think hiding will protect you? It only makes the cage smaller." The next afternoon, Mateo stood in the empty gym after school, the echo of his footsteps bouncing off the walls as he practiced the jarabe tapatio one last time. His movements were sharper now, more confident, the rhythm of the music pulsing through him like a second heartbeat. He spun, stomped, lost himself in the dance, until the sound of slow clapping cut through the air. His blood turned to ice. Jason leaned against the doorway, his smirk razor-sharp, flanked by two teammates. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like Mariachi Matt's got a secret talent." The laughter that followed was like sandpaper on Mateo's skin. One of Jason's friends mimicked a clumsy twirl, snickering. "You gonna wear a dress too?" The taunt hung in the air, ugly and heavy. For a second, Mateo froze, the old fear creeping back in. But then he remembered Abuelo's face in that photo, the quiet defiance in his eyes. He straightened his shoulders and met Jason's gaze. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I'm dancing. Got a problem with that?" Jason's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he shrugged. "Nah, should be hilarious." They sauntered off, their laughter trailing behind them. But Mateo didn't crumple this time. He turned back to the mirror, his reflection clearer than ever. That night, lying in bed, the doubts came rushing back. What if he messed up? What if the whole school laughed? What if he proved Jason right? His phone buzzed, a text from Elena. "You ready for tomorrow?" He didn't reply. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against his window, a restless, nervous sound that matched the churn in his stomach. He rolled over, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to drown out the voice in his head that screamed, "Back out, back out, back out." But then he thought of Abuela's hands on that photo album, the way she'd said the cage gets smaller. He thought of his grandfather singing in the face of hatred, and he thought of himself, not Matt, not the shadow he'd been pretending to be, but Mateo. Slowly, he reached for his phone and typed a single word, "Yeah." The reply came instantly. "Damn right you are." He exhaled, the tightness in his chest easing just a little. Tomorrow he would dance. Not for them, for himself. The stage lights burned hotter than Mateo had imagined, their glare turning the sea of faces in the auditorium into a blur of shadows and shifting shapes. His hands trembled at his sides, the silver embroidery of his charro suit, borrowed from his uncle's wedding closet, digging into his shoulders as he adjusted the fit one last time. Backstage, the muffled sounds of the jazz band's final notes faded, replaced by the rustling of programs and scattered whispers. The principal's voice boomed over the speakers. Next up, Mateo Lopez performing a traditional Mexican folk dance. A polite smattering of applause rippled through the crowd, but beneath it, Mateo caught the unmistakable snicker, Jason's laugh, sharp and mocking, slicing through the murmurs like a knife. His stomach lurched. For a wild, heart-stopping second, he considered bolting, ducking past the curtains, sprinting down the hallway, and never looking back. But then he thought of Abuela sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her eyes shining with something fiercer than pride. Battle ready, he realized. She had come to witness his victory or his defeat, but she had come for him. The opening chords of Jarabe Tapatio crackled through the speakers, the familiar trumpet blare jolting him into motion. His first step onto the stage was shaky, his boots scuffing the polished floor. But then the music swelled, and something inside him clicked. The dance was far from perfect. His spins were a fraction too slow, his stomps not quite in sync, but it didn't matter. The rhythm pulsed in his blood, in his bones, guiding him through each movement with a certainty that shocked him. The crowd's murmurs faded into silence, then, unbelievably, into scattered cheers as he launched into the zapateado, his heels striking the stage like drumbeats. Halfway through, he dared to look up, his gaze locking onto Jason's in the third row. The other boy's usual smirk was gone, replaced by something unreadable. Not laughter, not even pity, but something closer to recognition. Mateo held that stare as he spun, his body moving on instinct now, the music carrying him through the final crescendo. When the last note rang out, he froze, arms outstretched, chest heaving, the silence in the auditorium absolute for one breathless second. Then the room exploded. The applause was deafening, students leaping to their feet, teachers whistling through their fingers. Even Principal Higgins, a stoic man who rarely cracked a smile, was clapping with genuine enthusiasm. But it was Abuela's face that shattered him, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her hands pressed to her mouth as if she were holding in a sob. Then Elena was barreling onto the stage, throwing her arms around him, so hard he staggered. "Took you long enough," she muttered into his shoulder, her voice thick. Behind her, Jason lingered at the edge of the stage, his hands shoved in his pockets. For a tense moment, they just looked at each other. Then Jason gave a single, grudging nod. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't friendship, but it was respect. After the assembly, the halls of Ridgeview High felt different, lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. Classmates he'd never spoken to clapped him on the back. A freshman girl shyly asked if he'd teach her the dance. Even Tyler Miller, of the All-American Showcase, gave him an awkward thumbs up. But it was lunchtime that truly sealed the change. Instead of slipping into the library or the bathroom, Mateo walked straight to his usual table, pulled out a grease-stained paper bag, and unloaded a stack of churros onto the table. The cinnamon scent wafted through the air, drawing curious glances. Elena raised an eyebrow. "You're sharing?" she asked, her tone teasing but her eyes soft. Mateo grinned, breaking a churro in half and holding it out to her. "Yeah," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Anyone want one?" A hesitant hand went up, then another, and soon the churros were being passed around, the tension melting into laughter and sticky fingers. At the next table over, Jason watched, his expression unreadable. But when Mateo met his gaze, the other boy didn't look away. There were no grand speeches, no sudden friendships. But in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in years, Mateo Lopez sat in the crowded cafeteria, surrounded by the noise and chaos of high school, and didn't feel the need to hide. He took a bite of a churro, the sugar coating his tongue, and thought, "This is enough."